Greetings, everybody. Thanks for checking out this video. In today's video, I want to basically put a call out to you guys to help me finish some maps to finish the official moving out of alpha into beta release of BattleMercs. But also I want to show you guys how to make campaigns and stories and sort of RPG elements. So I want to dive into the JSON files a bit. Now, I know I've been a little absent. I was expecting to sort of disappear from Discord for a week. I disappeared for 3, and I'm trying to get back to wrapping up the finishing touches on at least the beta version of this game. And guys, the only explanation I have for you is that burnout is real. BattleMercs has been a passion of mine, a passion project. I've worked on it. I worked on it in secret for almost a year before releasing it, and then I've worked on it for a few more months after, the alpha and stuff came out. And it was like nights, weekends, weekdays. I would steal time away just in the middle of the day. I would ignore, family and friend obligations just to do this. And I don't know what it is, but I've hit a wall. And I've realized that in order to get to the beta, I need some help, and specifically with things like making maps. So let me explain to you guys what I would like to do to finish up the beta release at least, and then show you guys how the JSON files work. So what I want to ultimately package this game, BattleMercs, with is the career mode, which is more or less functional. I mean, it could use more varieties of contracts, which I've seen some people in the Discord have made things like VIP extraction contracts and stuff. That is awesome. In fact, I might reach out to that person and see if I can actually include those kinds of contracts officially in the release. But yeah, all the modding and stuff you guys are doing is awesome. So there's a career mode, which is more or less functional and can be tweaked along the way. That's pretty easy. But I wanted to also package in a basic campaign. And the reason I wanted to package in a campaign is because a campaign does more than just allow you to take contracts and run missions. A campaign will have events, will have stories, will have decision points. You may not be able to freely travel the inner sphere, maybe more linear. You may be pushed from planet to planet throughout the story. You may have moments of free travel, but it's more complex than just a career. And the campaign that I wanted to tell, the dream that I have always had, is what I'm calling the Crescent Hawks Legacy. It is a campaign that starts you basically in the shoes of Jason Youngblood on Pacifica, the Crescent Hawks Inception, basically. And you play through a shorter version of that in this engine. And then you carry on into the Crescent Hawks Revenge and play all of that. So basically, it's Crescent Hawks Inception, Revenge, the whole thing put together. I think for at least the beta, I have scaled back my ambitions, and I only want to produce the Crescent Hawks Inception campaign. And so this isn't going to be like a 36-hour campaign. This will just be a campaign with a handful of missions, a handful of events and stories, and so on. So what do I need in order to make this campaign a reality? Well, I need a couple of maps, and this is where I'm hoping you guys can help. So if you go into the Battletech Resources Campaigns Legacy Maps folder, so in the Legacy folder, you'll find the Maps folder. Right now, there are some maps already. For instance, here's the Citadel. This is a very basic version of the Citadel. It's actually more of like a testing area. I would like to remake this to be a little closer to the original Citadel. And honestly, I'll tell you, I actually have the original Citadel. Let's see here in this folder, extracted. And I think I threw this up on, Discord for everyone. Oh, maybe I haven't finished extracting the... I swore I thought I had the... Oh, here it is. Pacifica. Well, here's the starport at least. The Citadel's in here somewhere. Here's a starport exactly as it existed in the Crescent Hawks Inception. And I have the original training grounds as well. Truthfully, I think it would be kind of interesting to use the exact same maps, but at the same time, because this is more of a reimagining, I'd prefer to make a slightly newer map. And there's two reasons for this. One is the original Citadel and Starport maps are actually quite big, and to walk from building to building does take a fair amount of time. And I'm only talking like 30, 40 seconds. But if you're hanging out, going between training missions and stuff, there's a lot of dead space, a lot of dead buildings. So I'd kind of like to shrink these maps a little, make them a little closer to what I've created here, which is a much smaller testing area. But also, you know, I'd like to make our own stuff for this game rather than just relying on what has previously existed. So yeah, we can look at these maps for inspiration, but here's what I'm thinking we need in order to do this campaign. We need a map of the Citadel, of the original training grounds. We need a map of the Starport. We need a couple of towns from the various towns that you could explore around Pacifica, and then we need a few overworld maps. So here's an example overworld map I was working on. You can see the tiles have been screwed up because I built this map on an older version of the tile sets, which have changed, and so now things are a little screwy, but like this was a path. You know, these are lakes and stuff. So Pacifica is pretty simple. It just has paths, lakes, and forests. There's no mountains or... I mean, I guess we could add hills if we wanted. But yeah, basically, so here's the call. Volunteer if you'd like to help make a Citadel map, a Starport map, some overworld maps. The more people who volunteer and help make some maps, the better. We'll do what we can to try and make the overworld maps feel consistent. You know, if different people are making different overworlds, we don't want the maps to feel totally different. So hopefully people look at each other's maps and try and make them somewhat consistent. But if you guys can help me make some maps, we could do this Pacific campaign pretty easily, I think. Because one of the big hitches for me is, I've said before, map making is not my passion. I do it reluctantly, and with this mental block I've hit with doing more work on the game, it's like, if the maps don't get done, like I just know myself, it's not going to happen. So anyway, there's the first call for help. The second thing that we can look at today are the JSON files. So let's go into the files here. And I'm going to open up the sort of Crescent Legacy campaign as it currently exists and show you how some of these JSON files work. So this video will be a little longer on the tail end here, and we're going to focus all on the JSON files, because you guys, I think, already know more or less how maps work. And if you have any questions, just post in the Discord. So here is, actually, let's go to the startup, and we'll start walking through what's happening in the startup. So the JSON files are basically just, they're called JavaScript object nodes. They're basically just dictionary files. You have sort of a key and a value. So here, you know, in the startup JSON file, we have some special keys like names, descriptions, splash image to use. And then we have this trigger called, or this key called first trigger. And this says, look for the trigger called startup. Now, typically a JSON file is associated with a map. So every map will have triggers. So if we come to a map, you know, here's a trigger like the player spawn and their enemy spawns and the starport spawn. If a unit encounters, basically walks into the area where this object is, then the game will look for something called starport spawn in triggers. If it finds a trigger called starport spawn, it will do the things that are in that trigger. So that is one way that triggers get called, if units walk into them on maps. And so, for instance, if we go to our Citadel here, you know, here's the mech bay, here's the bar. There is, in the Pacifica Citadel JSON file, there's a trigger called mech bay. And when my character walks into this trigger, that mech bay gets called. So in fact, let's take a little detour here. Now I'm in the Pacifica Citadel JSON file, and oh, actually, sorry, the mech bay actually ends up in there's an extra JSON file that gets loaded for Pacifica, and it's in there. So you know what? Here, let me load it up. General RPG one mech bay. There it is. So when your character walks into mech bay, there's a trigger called mech bay. And here are the trigger's properties. It is a prompt, meaning a prompt is going to appear to the player. This is the width of the prompt. So by default for prompts, you can specify, if you just give one number, then that's the width, and the prompt figures out how tall it should be. You could give the exact dimensions. So if you want specific height and width, you can give a list, so 2 values. But if you just give one value, the game sort of calculates, it sets the width to 400 pixels and it figures out the height based on everything else. And everything else includes things like the text. This prompt is going to show enter Mechitloop, the question. Then there are going to be some options. And in this case, there are 2 options. So options are a list and they're a list of objects. Each object has a text and then an action that it performs and any arguments that go along with that action. So if you say yes, if you enter that mech bay trigger and you get the prompt enter Mechitloop and you say yes, then what's going to happen is we're going to call another trigger, and this trigger is going to be called mech bay inside. So if we do a search in here, you'll find another trigger called mech bay inside. It's another prompt. So the game is basically a chain of triggers. One trigger can trigger another trigger, can trigger another trigger, and so on. You can see here now we're specifying not only the width, but also the height of the prompt. And because the mech bay is a little more complex, we don't just want to show a question and then some options. We're actually going to have multiple frames. So a frame is sort of like a sub window in a prompt. And so my prompt is 800 pixels wide, but my first frame is going to start 600 pixels over to the right at the very top, and it's just going to be a little square. It's going to be a 200 by 200 square. And what we're going to show in that square is the little mech bay icon. So if we actually run our game really quickly here, I can show you exactly where that frame is on the screen, just so you guys can get a sense of it. So you go in here. Now you walk over. So we're going to encounter the trigger now. There's the question. I say yes, it's going to launch the other trigger, which is mech bay inside. And here's the frame that is showing the little dudes in the Mechitloop. That is what this image is. We have another frame that starts in the top left corner of the prompt. It is only 600 pixels wide and 400 tall, and the text reads, "You have entered the mech bay and look around, blah, blah, blah." So that is this frame here. Notice that the frames automatically have the border, the sort of gray metallic border thing. You can, if you want, come in and say border is 0 if you want, if you don't want the border. But by default, frames will have a border. And then we have some various options in here. So I got mechs that need patching up, blah, blah, blah. And you can see those options are showing up here. Each option, if you click on it, will call another trigger. So repair bay, mech market, selling bay. So you can go and look at all these triggers, and these triggers are basically just other prompts that open up that have other actions. Eventually, the actions you want to perform are more complex than just opening another prompt or calling another trigger. Eventually, you might want to start doing some things like modifying mechs, moving mechs into the player's inventory, repairing mechs, all sorts of stuff. And so we'll look at some of those triggers here today. But the best way you can learn if you want to dig around in the JSON files, if you want to learn, like, how does the game do X? Well, just look in the JSON files and find in the files where that thing is occurring and look at the actions that are being performed. And the actions should be pretty self-explanatory. But again, we'll walk through some of the basic ones at least. Okay, so we got a little distracted. I wanted to walk you through startup first. So, and actually, am I even in the right startup? We want the legacy startup. All right. So in the startup JSON file, we have a first trigger. That trigger is called startup, so here's the startup trigger. Now, because this is starting up the entire game, there's a bunch of actions being performed, and they are not just opening prompts, they're doing all sorts of things. So, for instance, here we are setting up some special variables. So, like, what is the paint palette going to be when you go into the paint shop? When you select a unit during battle, what prompts should be shown. So if we were to actually go into a battle, I'll just hop into training really quickly here. See here. Oh, I already finished my training. Okay, hold on. Main menu. Just gonna hop in here and begin as recruit. All right, so let me go into just the first training mission and blah, blah, blah. Okay, here's my locust. When I select the locust, all this that's being shown down here is actually a prompt. And you can modify this. So if you want to modify the game so that you see different things when you select a unit, you can totally do that. So if you look in the startup, battle unit selection file, that is found in scripts, frames, battle unit selection. So we can look for battle unit selection, and we can see it's just another JSON file. It's basically for just a prompt. So it has a position, it has subframes, and it's calling certain variables. So for instance, the text it wants to show the selected unit's name. So selected unit get name. And because we have these squirrely brackets around the text, that will grab the actual variable name. If I didn't have the squirrely brackets, then when I selected my locust name here would literally say selected unit : get name. By adding the squirrely brackets, you're telling the game to actually try and get a variable value. So you can use the squirrely brackets to access variables if you want to display values, if you want to calculate or modify values, add money to the player, take money away. There's a money variable, and we'll see that in just a moment. So if I wanted, let's see here, selected unit get name, I'll just say ha ha ha, why not? And I'll save this. If I relaunch the game and I go back into my training, we can walk back over into the training field. And when I select this unit, it's called a locust, ha ha ha, because I added the text ha ha ha. You can poke around in this battle unit selection file and see all the other things that it does. It gets the pilot call signs, their description, it gets their model, which is basically their image. It gets their health, and it draws horizontal health bars. So, these health bars are things you could modify. You can make them smaller, bigger. You can draw them vertically if you prefer. So you can literally come in this battle unit selection JSON file and change what you see when you select units in battle. And so similarly, there's a bunch of other files that are getting specified here. When you select an enemy, what do you see? Right? When you select an enemy in battle, you see different information than when you select your own unit. That is just another selection file. This is the battle status bar. This means this on the left-hand side. Right? So you can open this and you can modify. Do you want that to appear on the left-hand side, the top, the right, the bottom? Do you want it to show more than just the 12 spots for your units? Do you want to show more than 12 units? You can do all that. The RPG status bar is this bar at the very top. Pacifica, the date, and the C-bills that you have. So if we open up the RPG status bar, you'll see that it is a prompt that basically is the entire width of the screen. The game uses a resolution of 1280 by 720. It's only 30 pixels tall, and it just has 3 frames. The first frame shows the variable current planet. The next frame shows month, name, day, comma, year. So you can put multiple variables in a text string if you want. So this is an example of that. Then here's another example where you have money, and then you have some just hard-coded text, which is C-bills. And you can change the text color to green, the text size, you can align it, everything you want. One thing to note is this text dynamic is quite important if you want to actually display text variables to the screen. If you have to set text dynamic to be equal to true if you want these variables to update. So notice the date just changed. That's because the variable for the day changed and updated, and the text also updated. If this was not set to dynamic, and by default it's not, what will happen is when this is first drawn, it will draw out the current variable value, and then it will never change, even if the variable changes. So if you want text or anything else, well, I guess it's just text, but if you want text that updates dynamically as variables change, you have to set this flag text dynamic is equal to true. Okay, so what else have we got? The star map file, this is a pretty important file. The star map file determines what planets exist in the game, but also determines all sorts of things about technology and stuff that is available. So the star map file, you can see it uses a background image, which, let's see here. We hop into again. So this drawing of the inner sphere, that is the image that is being shown in the background. If I change this to, IS 3030, which is another image that I've got in the resources, then you can see, then this background sprite will change and you'll see a different set of borders, but none of the data changes. This is just sort of a background image. So if you want to make custom universes or custom areas, you can basically just create some custom drawn borders and stuff and then swap the image out. Base colors, this is used by sprites in order to swap colors. So when you go into battle, if you're fighting the Capellans, they're all green. If you're fighting House Merrick, they're purple. These are color codes for the 8 different colors that get used for mech sprites that are swapped. So let's see, I think these are the grays. The first 4 are grays, and then the next 4 are the blues, so for like the cockpits. And if you scroll down to the different houses, then they have a list of what colors to swap in for the base colors. So this is for Steiner, so they will be blue-focused colors that get swapped in that replace the grays. There's all sorts of, we could spend a whole video just going through the star map file, so I'll just cover it very briefly. But the star map file identifies what mechs are available, what technology, so what weapons and stuff are available. And if you're wondering, well, where are the mechs specified? There is a units JSON file that's in the data folder of the legacy, and in the career as well. And this specifies all the different units that are in the game. So look, elementals and infantry are in the game, even though they're not technically used at all, but they're there. At least sort of a test version of them. But here are all the clan mechs, eventually get down to like the 2750 mechs and then the inner sphere mechs and so on. So people have already been digging around in the unit files and in the weapon files to make mods. So I don't think I have to cover this in great detail, but this is where you would find these things. So there's PPCs and large lasers, and here's all their stats about like their range and their heat and how much damage they cause and their tonnage and their critical space and stuff. And then there's a parameter called FX, which is usually the most complex part of a weapon, which details how to draw it and all sorts of stuff like that. So I'll leave this to experimentation. You can monkey around with these parameters if you want to try and get weapons to draw differently. But okay, going back to, I guess, before we leave the star map. So available tech, available units. There's all sorts of information about contracts that are available. And so there's sort of like contract templates. So when you go to a planet, each planet specifies a template, like maybe planets near the periphery are periphery easy planets. And they will have contracts that have these general parameters, you know. The enemies will be green. The enemy factions will be one of either bandits, pirates, or rebels. The advance pay will range between 800,000 to 1.2 million C-bills. You know, here's the total pay, the salvage picks. So these are ranges, minimum and maximum, minimum and maximum, minimum and maximum. And then you'll have the files that actually determine the contracts. So these are all the contracts that you could potentially see on an easy peripheral world. So death match against one medium group, against one light group, two light groups, defense against one wave, etc. So those are the contracts. And once you get past the contract templates, then there's factions. So, you know, let's go to House Steiner. This is their house, this is their nation, this is their logo, these are their friends, these are their enemies. So enemies you will get contracts against, friends you'll never get a contract fighting against them. Every house can also have what's called prevalent units, and these are units that are more common for them than average. So although every house has access to every available unit, so if you come back up over here, every house can potentially have access to every single one of these available units, they will tend to field the prevalent units. And this is to give each faction a flavor. So, you know, House Steiner tends to field different mechs than House Merrick, though they all can field any mech, really. If you're fighting, you know, House Merrick, you will tend to see these mechs more often. And if you're fighting, let's see, the Capellans, you'll tend to see these mechs more frequently. And the Draconis Combine, you tend to see these mechs. So that's what the prevalent mechs are about. And the only other major thing I'll cover right now is here are the different planets. So they have coordinates. Basically, 0, 0 is the total center of the universe. So 0, 0 would be like here. Although technically this isn't actually at the center of the image. So if you look up Earth, it's slightly adjusted. The actual center is somewhere around here. And I even had a center reference planet I was using to see the actual center when I was spacing all the planets originally. But anyway, every planet has a faction, a description, an icon. For contracts, you could manually specify all the contracts or just use a template. It's much simpler to use a template because rather than, you know, a lot of planets are going to use more or less the same contracts. So rather than specifying every single planet, they have all these different individualized contracts. And then if you add a new mission to a contract, you have to go into like 20 planets and add it. Just make a template. So central normal. If we go look up in the template central normal, we'll see the kind of contracts that you get for this planet. And then this is, so when you actually select the planet, so when you actually, you know, try to go to a planet, and you click OK, then what happens is this action and these arguments are launched. The action is launch a new RPG map, the map that we want to use. So for Alarian, we're going to use the small temperate map, and the script we're going to use is the medium planet RPG. So we'll see this again in the startup, but basically the way the game works is if you want to load an RPG map, you call an action called new RPG, and then you have to tell it what map. And if you don't give it a script, it will just look for smalltemperate.json. So by default, if you give the game a map, it will just assume there's a corresponding JSON. However, you can override that default JSON by manually specifying a JSON file if you want. And the JSON files determine everything that's going on in that map. So we'll look at that in more detail shortly. But if you go to this planet, it's a temperate planet, and this JSON file will determine the kinds of mechs and all sorts of other things that are happening on that planet. Here's another planet. If you were to go to this planet, you would launch a new RPG, and that would open the small desert map with this JSON file. So new RPG is how you load new RPGs. And I will show you how you load new battles as well. But if we come back to, oops, wrong startup. If we come back to the legacy startup, so we finished setting our map file. I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit, but we're not going to leave just yet. One of the last actions that gets performed is we launch a new RPG, we open up the Pacifica Citadel map, and because we haven't specified a script, so we don't have, you know, a script variable in here. We've just left it blank. What will happen is the game is going to look for Pacifica Citadel.json, and if we go into our resources, we will see that that exists. So campaigns, legacy, maps. So when Pacifica Citadel, the map is opened, this by default is loaded as the JSON file. If we go to Pacifica Citadel, if I can spell Citadel. This is the JSON file that gets loaded when you go to Pacifica. And as we will see, it has its own set of triggers that are going to do all sorts of things. It's going to create lists of technology and mechs that are for sale. It's going to set up the bar. It's going to see what pilots are available for hire. So a lot happens in this JSON file. We will get to that shortly. I just wanted to show you as well, there's this other parameter when you load a map called mods. And this is if you want more JSON files to stack on top of whatever is loaded by default. So the Pacifica Citadel JSON file is going to load all the basic stuff that happens in Pacifica. But then on top of that, we're going to override and add to it, and we're going to add Pacifica Citadel Mission 1. And in the Pacifica Citadel Mission 1 JSON file, this file only contains a couple triggers. In fact, it only contains one trigger. And this trigger is what's going to happen when you walk into the training arena. It's going to say, welcome, you know, ready for mission 1. And if you say yes, it's going to launch a new battle, and it's going to launch mission 1. If we didn't have this, if that wasn't there, then when you walk into the training field, nothing will happen. Or in fact, actually I have it coded so that it will tell you there's no more training to be done. If instead you modded this Pacifica, if you modded Pacifica with mission 2 or mission 3 or mission 4, you would start on those missions. So basically, you can not only load a map, and you can not only customize which JSON file gets loaded with it, but you can stack extra JSON files one on top of the other. Now, why would you want to do this? Well, you'd want to stack multiple JSON files because maybe different JSON files contain different things that might be relevant at different times. So for instance, the welcome JSON file is that welcome message when you start the game where it says, welcome to BattleMercs, blah, blah, blah. We don't want that loading every time you go to the Citadel. So we don't want the pop-up message that comes at the beginning of the very game to appear in the Pacifica Citadel JSON file, because then it would occur every single time you go to Pacifica. Instead, we just add it as a mod here this one time, and every future time that we come to Pacifica, we're not going to add this on as a mod, and so that welcome message will never show up again. So this is sort of a powerful way, you know, playing with these JSON files and putting different things in different files and either adding them as mods or including them in other ways is a powerful way to reuse maps and load up a map, but then have different things happening on the map today than tomorrow. So this same Pacifica map is used for mission 1, mission 2, mission 3, mission 4. We don't have to make 6 versions of this map in order to go to the training arena and have different options every time. We just need to mod the map with different missions ahead of time. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Okay, we're going to go to this very soon and start to see the nuts and bolts of actually what's happening in these Pacifica JSON files. But before we do, there's a few other things that happened here. So there's some basic code to like set up the interval of like stock updates and stuff and to set the stock. So stocks are in the goods.json file. I've noticed that people have already started to go make their own stocks, which is great. Hey, we can turn this into a stock trading game. Why not? So I did have some ideas about allowing you to trade cargo as well as stocks, but cargo isn't in the game yet, but you can see here's some stats for it, and maybe it will appear soon. But here's the actual stocks themselves, and you can see their initial cost and their drift. And so, you know, some will make you rich and some will make you broke. And if it's like real life, like me, every time you put money in the stock market, it will go down. Okay, we have an action called set planet. What this is going to do, this has to be called after the star map is chosen. It will set the current planet that you're on to Pacifica. So it will look in the star map and it will try and find Pacifica, and it will set that as your planet. Why does this matter? Because the planet you're on determines who the faction is that controls the planet. It determines who's offering contracts. It determines what kinds of mechs are available, what kind of mechs are prevalent, what kind of technology is available. So if you do not set a planet in your startup script, the game will crash and it won't load right. If you try and set a planet before you've loaded the star map, then it's not going to work. So some of these things are occurring in the exact right order. If you want to make your own campaign, I would say take this campaign and just slowly modify and change things into your campaign. Starting from total scratch is kind of a waste of time. Just take one of my campaigns and modify it. That's a better way to do it. Okay, here is a very important action we're going to see a lot. var. var stands for variable, and it means that I'm going to be passing in a variable statement, and this needs to be evaluated. So basically, when I say var, this is going to set a variable called money to be equal to 0, meaning that right now I have no money. It's 0. Here's another important variable that you need to set. This is setting the current date. So this is just setting the date to the year 3025, May the 21st. So pretty straightforward there. And we're also setting up an action. So this is basically a listener. So when the date changes, we're going to update the star map. And so again, just some of these are more hard-coded in than others, but that just needs to be there. Next, we have another trigger or another action you'll see a fair amount called new list. New list creates a list of units or pilots. And as you'll see, in fact, I'll give you a little preview. We go to the Pacifica Citadel JSON file. There are all sorts of lists that we end up producing for most basic maps. So for instance, a list of units that are for sale, a black market list of units that are for sale, a list of units that are for rent, a list of crew that are for hire, tech for sale. So, you can make your own lists at any point if you want, or you can have them at the startup of loading a map. And so a list is basically just a collection of crew or units. So we're going to create a new list called player crew, and this is a list that's necessary to run the game. And this is a persistent list. So by default, lists get cleared out every time you change to a different planet, right? You don't want the tech for sale on Luthien to still exist when you go to, Tharkad. So lists by default just get erased every time you shift planets. But if you set a list to persistent, it will never be erased. And so the list that holds the player crew, the player mechs, and the player tech, you kind of want that to exist forever. So this just initiates some empty lists for us. Here's an action called add to list. And here we're going to add to the player crew list that we just created. And we're going to add a crew unit. And crew units can take a variety of parameters. By the way, if you don't pass any parameters, so if I just erase all of this, then I'll just add a random crew member. It'll be a totally randomly generated crew member. But I can override the random decisions, and I can specify a specific first name, last name, call sign, or nickname. I can hard code the gender. I can select a specific portrait, set the maximum health to whatever I want, and then I can also go in and set skills. Again, if this isn't here, then the crew member generated is totally random. But we want to create Jason Youngblood, so here he is. Lastly, we run our new RPG action, and we load our Pacifica map, and we load all these extra JSON files. So I've already said the welcome JSON contains the welcome message. This contains a trigger that basically says when you go into the training ground, show the option for the first training mission. And I forget what's in the pre-mission ready. Let's see. Pre-mission ready. If you ever forget, just go look at these files. So this is just a couple of triggers that are saying, they're kind of locking things off. So they're stopping you from going to the starport, right? You should finish your training mission before you think about heading off world. So again, this is a mod JSON file. In the default Pacifica, there will be a trigger called star map check. And when you go there, it will put you in the starport and allow you to pick what planet you want to travel to. But because we are modding the JSON file that gets loaded in, what's happening is we're going to open this JSON file and we're going to overwrite the star map check with this new prompt that comes up that basically doesn't let you in. So we're kind of locking off the star map using this technique, and we're locking off contracts as well. So this JSON file is very important. If this wasn't here, then even if I was on mission 1, I could go to the starport and travel to whatever planet I want. So this is a JSON file that's going to mod or replace some triggers that already exist so that certain things get locked off. All right, new RPG is going to load in this map. It is going to load in the Pacifica Citadel JSON file. These files are going to get stamped on top and override or add to the existing JSON file. But let's take a look at that existing JSON file. So we want Pacifica Citadel JSON. So here we are. Now the first thing to note is that we have this statement here called include. And we're going to include some other JSON triggers. So you can see how important these JSON files are to making the game function, and how it really is just sort of a chain of triggers. So the map gets loaded, and then this JSON file opens up. So this JSON file contains everything that makes up the Pacifica experience, but we have also included this general RPG JSON file. So what's going to happen with the general JSON, this is like modding the file, but what this is doing is every time this JSON file opens up, it automatically mods itself and adds the general RPG. So the general RPG is like permanently linked to it. Now, what's in the general RPG JSON file are triggers that are common among every single RPG map or battle that you're ever really going to encounter. So for instance, the escape menu, right? Like this comes up when you press escape. You have status, options, save game, load game, etc. And then there's all sorts of like helper triggers. So like get save game name, save confirm, load confirm. And you can see there are literally hundreds of triggers in here that are needed to do everything from like buying stocks to repairing mechs, to modding mechs, to painting mechs, to hiring people, everything. So this would be a lot to dig through. Do that at your own leisure, but this is what is in the general RPG JSON file. It's basically every trigger that might be relevant across all RPG experiences. And we wouldn't want to put that into every single JSON for any individual map, because there'd be, hundreds of, duplicates of these, triggers all over the place. And then if I decide to change the escape menu, I have to go into every single map's JSON file and change the escape menu. That doesn't make any sense. So this is a common area to put in things that are supposed to be the same in basically every map. Next, we specify where the player should spawn, right? So we've loaded this map. The game has no idea where to put the player. Well, there's a little trigger in here called player spawn, and that's where the player's going to spawn. So player spawn is player spawn. Next, how many NPCs do we want randomly wandering around, the city? Maybe we want 120 of those random buggers. You can do that. You'll have a very crowded city. The game might potentially lag a bit, but 12, these are just the random NPCs wandering around. Next, we have what's called the refresh trigger, and I'm blanking on that a little bit, but I think this gets called every time the map comes up. But basically, this is your startup trigger. Next, you have lists. So these lists are going to be generated and used for various things. Again, here's a list of units that are for sale. It's a unit list, meaning a mech list. It's special in that it uses the house unit. So whatever faction of the planet that you're on, it's going to try and use units that would come from them. So again, every available mech is in play, but the prevalent mechs for that house are extra in play. If I took this out, as you see with the black market, then you'll just have mechs drawn from the available pool, and there'll be no special preference given to the prevalent mechs. This is the size. The list will be it'll be 3 to 6 items long. So again, minimum, maximum. If I wanted it to always be 10 mechs, I could just put 10, right? But if you want a range, you give it 2 values, and you have to put them in these square brackets because you're technically passing a list with just 2 entries in minimum, maximum. On Pacifica, we have a limit. The maximum tonnage is 25, so mechs are quite light on Pacifica. That's how it was in the Crescent Inception. That's why it's like that way here. You can make the maximum tonnage 50 or 100. You can make the minimum tonnage whatever you want. You can basically just mess with parameters to control how the list gets generated. And then we have something called a cost ratio. This is basically every unit in the game. So if we go back to the unit sheet for a while here. So every unit has a cost, but it'd be pretty boring if every single Hornet you ever encountered costs 1.441 million units and 600. I said that really weird. 1,441,600 C-bills, right? It'd be so boring if every single unit always costs the exact same amount. And so this cost ratio is going to take the cost of each unit and multiply it by a random number between 0.9 and 1.1, meaning sometimes it'll be slightly below its cost, up to 90%. That'd be the lowest it would ever get, 90% of its listed cost, up to 10% above its listed cost, right? 1.1. Now look, the black market, sometimes there's no mechs available, sometimes there's 6 mechs available, and you can get mechs for up to half off. But mechs can sometimes also cost 50% more. So black market has more swing, right? We also deal with the black market differently. With the for sale units, you have a list, and you can just look at them and see all the ones that are available and make a decision. With the black market, a mech comes up, you have to make a decision, yes or no. If you say no, it's gone forever. So the black market is, yes, you can get mechs at a deep discount, but even if you see a mech at kind of an overpriced price, you have to make a decision about yes or no in that moment. If you say no, then, tough luck. So kind of a different way of selling mechs to you. And I'll show you those 2 different ways in the JSON. Next, we have mechs that are for rent. This is for use if you go into the arena. Next, this is just actually a leftover list that's not doing anything in the game right now, but it demonstrates that you can actually specify the exact units that make up a list. So these lists are going to randomly generate mechs. What if you specifically want certain mechs in a list? Well, you just have this list parameter, and you literally name out the mechs that you want to exist in this list, and those mechs will now exist in that list. You can also have crew lists. So this is the crew for hire. Again, cost ratios and stuff. And then tech for sale. So hopefully that's all self-explanatory. So that's the lists area of the map JSON. Next we have what's called prep maps. And these are maps that are prepped and can be used for things. So for instance, the betting maps that are used in the arena. So if you want to place a bet on the grand tournament or on individual arena bets, These are, this is the map that comes when you rent a mech for the arena. Sorry, I'm having like a brain fart here. And then here are contracts. Essentially, you know, just look at how I'm using some of these things and you'll sort of figure it out. And truthfully, like sometimes I have to go back and sort of rethink what is happening in this bit of JSON file. It's been a while since I've looked at this stuff. But we're basically just saying, hey, prepare a map called Arena Bet. And this is basically going to be a list of somewhere between 2 and 6 maps. And the scripts that go along with those maps can be found in scripts/betting. So if we go in here, we can say, okay, so we want maps. Oh, wait. We have to come in here into the main resources, find scripts, betting, and then there'll be this default betting, a JSON file. So if we open that up, why was that not found? Default betting. Default betting. Oh, weird. So the default betting script has its own startup, and it's saying, you know, draw maps from the arena maps. So if we come in here, we can go into maps, arena. Here are all the potential arena maps. So the default betting script is saying, hey, you can find maps in default betting maps. The mission, so the mission parameters can be found in the last man standing. And then, you know, because you're betting, you don't get to select a unit. You know, here's some triggers. And then here are some forces and stuff. We'll look a bit more in these battle JSON files later, but suffice to say, you can sort of follow the chain of JSON files to try and get a sense of like where things are happening. Okay. Oh, and you know, here's an example where, you know, for the contracts that we're going to have in this RPG area, the scripts are not hard-coded. Instead, we're going to access a variable called current planet info contracts files, and that will actually contain information from the star map. So if we go back to the star map, if we go to a contract template, right, periphery normal has a variable called files, and in there we list off all the different potential contracts you could encounter. So that's what we're accessing over here, is we're going to the current planet, going into the contracts area, and we're finding the files that are available. Okay, hopefully you're following all this. Building triggers, this is used only for the NPCs. This doesn't have to be here. Basically, you know how NPCs can walk up and enter buildings and then leave? This is just a list of triggers that if an NPC encounters it, it will enter that building for some period of time, and then it will leave eventually. So that's all that building triggers is. Now we get to the triggers area, and then here we go. We have our own startup here on the RPG. Actions X is something that is not going to execute because it's sort of like X'd it out. So if the game ever encounters an unknown key, it just ignores it. So actions X isn't a special kind of actions. These are actions that are being ignored right now. So here are the actual startup actions. So we're going to define a variable called wager limit. We're going to make it equal to 5 million. We're going to generate a random variable between 0 and 1. If you just do 0 and 1, it will think that you want an integer, so it will randomly select 0 or 1. If you give it a floating point, it will think that you want a floating point, so we'll generate a decimal between 0 and 1.0. So that's how you basically control rand var. You can either generate integers or you can generate floating points. But anyway, we're going to have a variable called grand tourney. It's going to be equal to 0, somewhere between 0 and 1. And what we have here is an if statement. We're saying if the grand tourney variable is less than 0.05, then do this action. So one of the, actions are one of the big ways you're going to make your own RPGs in this game, but if statements are also very important. If statements are basically how you make conditions, right? So the grand tournament only appears sometimes. It appears 5% of the time. Notice we're also using another kind of action here. Rather than calling trigger, we're calling Q trigger. And that is because when you first go into the map, there might be a couple different pop-ups that want to appear. There might be the welcome screen and the grand tourney notification, and maybe you just failed a mission, so that wants to appear. If I were to just say trigger, then this would just pop up on top of everything else that had popped up. So if I already had some message boxes pop up, this would just appear on top of them. But the grand tourney announcement is low priority. It can appear after everything else is done. So I'm just going to use Q trigger here. And this means the tournament announcement won't appear until no other prompts currently exist. So if there's other prompts that are more important, they'll appear first. Now we're setting some variables. Buy ratio is equal to 0.67. Sell ratio is equal to 0.25. This is just going to be used when we're buying and selling some mechs. Okay, here are some other triggers. Training over, mech yard. So essentially, if you want to create an RPG style event, what you need to do is create some triggers that have pop-up boxes that do things. So for instance, here's one that appears after you finish training. Congratulations on completing your training. There'll be more to learn in future, blah, blah, blah. So here's some flavor text. Then you have some options, and the only option you have is something called thanks. So you'll see the words thanks on the screen. When you click it, rather than doing one action, you're going to be doing several actions. So we've seen a lot of action. This is actions. We can pass a list of actions if we want. So we open our list, and then every action is held within its own object, so it needs those squirrely brackets. So first action we're going to do is we're going to give the player $500,000. So money is plus equal to $500,000. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to add to the player mechs a chameleon. And this is because in the text we say, now that you've completed your training, here, take your chameleon, enjoy. So you can add items to players' lists. You can add crew members, you can add mechs. You can also remove items, and you can remove mechs. Next, we're going to call an action called self-mod. This is going to mod the current JSON file that is running everything in the game. And we're going to pull in this JSON file called training over. And so basically, if you are in the middle of a map, you're playing, an RPG and you make some decision, you can literally call a JSON file that's going to come in and modify triggers on that map. So maybe there's a bunch of areas of the map that are currently, you try and go to the door and the bouncer won't let you in. So you go somewhere else and talk to someone and you say the right thing. You can call an action that will mod the current triggers and replace the trigger that says you can't come in here, chump, with another JSON file that replaces that trigger with, hey, I heard you talk to Sally, come on in, right? And then when you say okay to that, it launches another trigger that launches a new RPG and loads up the bar map or something like that. So self-mod is very important for modifying the currently running JSON that is you are currently in at this very moment. Let's look at a few others here, because there's a few other things I want to make sure to show you guys. So if you want, variables to be equal to text, you just say equals, and then open the text with a single quote. Technically, you're supposed to close it, but the game doesn't care, so I haven't been bothering to close it. But technically, that would be mech yard trigger is equal to mech yard break-in can't. So this is the mech yard break-in mini event. If you go, let's see. If you go over to the mech yard in the current Pacifica map, you can look closer, and then you can select break-in. And that's basically what we're looking at here. So this is sort of an RPG style event. You would need to come back with a proper crew to do that. How did we get there? Well, what we did is we performed some actions and we did a bunch of if checks. And notice that, so this is actually good. This shows a couple of different ways you can use the if statement. We've seen that you can simply call an if statement anywhere you have an action in args, and these will now become conditional. So these won't run unless this if statement is true. However, you can create conditions. So if this is true, do this, but if it's false, do something else. You can have true falses as well. So here's an example of that. You could say, if this thing is true, then do this, or false, and you could have another set of actions. I'm just going to copy the same actions for demonstration, but this would now check this if statement, and if it's true, it would do this, and if it's false, it would do this. So you can make true falses. You can also have if statements that check for multiple conditions. So here's how you do some ands. So if this and this are true, then do this action. And so if you pass a list to an if statement, a list of texts, the first text that you pass should be either and or. So you unfortunately can't mix ands and ors. It's a bit of a pain, I know, but just for coding purposes, I was trying to keep things simple. But you can say and or, and if you say and, it's going to check if both of these are true. And if you say or, it's going to check if just one of them is true. You can have ands and ors. Notice here that we are also doing something. We're finding, we're searching through the player crew, and we're trying to find find the maximum skill they have for lockpicking. Find the maximum skill they have for acrobats. So what you can do in your RPGs is you can say, I'm going to look through the player's crew, and if they have certain skills at certain levels, I'm going to let certain things happen. So if the player has lockpicking of 3 or greater, then the mech yard trigger is equal to mech yard break-in lockpick only. If they have an acrobatics skill, then it's mech yard break-in acro only. Let's see. If they have lockpicking and acrobatics, then they get a choice. And up here, we set mech yard trigger by default to be can't break in. So what's happening when you're trying to break in is first it's saying, okay, the trigger we're probably going to run is that you can't break in. But if you can lockpick, if you have somebody in your crew who's good enough at lockpicking, then we're going to give you the lockpicking option. If you have someone with acrobatics, we'll give you the acrobatics option. But, if you have both, we're going to give you both. And then at the very end, we're going to call a trigger, and we're going to call that variable that we've been setting. So again, if you don't have people with the right skills, then you're going to get, you can't break in. But if you have people of one or both skills, you'll get different options. So this is how you can create some really interesting events in your RPGs. And you can look at characters who have different skills and see, do they meet certain criteria for certain events to be possible? You could also set variables, right? Like I could create a hidden building where there's like a guy you have to talk to. And if you talk to him, then I'm going to call an action of var, and I'll say talk to man equals 1, meaning you talked to him. And in my startup, I would set talk to man equals 0, meaning you hadn't talked to him. Later on, maybe you get to a bouncer and you're trying to get into a bar, and I can say, if talk to man is equal to 1, then you're allowed in. So do the trigger where bouncer lets you in. But otherwise, if false, then go to bouncer denies you. And what that would do is you would now have 2 events in your RPG where if you've talked to somebody previously or accomplished something or done something, a variable gets set that will now allow you to experience something differently in your later triggers. So this is the basic nuts and bolts of how you make your RPGs. It's triggers and variables and doing checks. And you can check for all sorts of different things. You can check to see if people own certain kinds of mechs and all sorts of stuff. There's too many kinds of checks for me to go through. But basically, if you know how to read the JSON files, you can go and look at everything I've done in everything from battles to RPGs to look at what is possible. So, when you by the way, find a person. So let's see. So you find somebody who has acrobatics. That person you found gets thrown into a variable called skilled crew. And so you can access them through skilled crew, and you can access their name as a subcomponent of that variable if you want. Let's see. What else is in here? There's a lot of breaking into the mech yard. Okay. Let's take a quick look at the general RPG, because there's a lot more complex logic going on in here. And then we'll take a quick look at battles. But hopefully, I know this is going to be a really long video. Hopefully the people who are still watching, this is going to be really helpful for them for making their things. Making their own games. Here's something else too, by the way. You know, I've shown you that you can have a trigger that can bring up a prompt. You can also have triggers that basically just have actions, so there's no prompt. You can also have a trigger that opens up a file, and all the logic is in that file. So for mod bay, rather than hard coding in all the mod bay parameters into this general JSON file, all the parameters can be found in this mod bay file. So if I open this up, this is a prompt, and this shows you the modification bay and all the parameters that go along with that. I'm not going to be covering how to create your own mod bays, paint bays, you know, battle unit selection, salvage screens. I think that would be like just a whole other video. Like that's like a 2-hour talk right there. But again, if you dig around and play with things, you can probably make some progress figuring stuff out. But okay, so here's the mech market. This is where you buy mechs. I will show you guys this. So in addition to having options, you can also have something called a list. Now, this is a little complex. I don't 100% remember it all off the top of my head. Sometimes I have to dig around the code a bit. But basically, this is an item list. Each option shows whatever item. So it'll go through the list one item at a time. So it'll show each item and its name. And on the right side, so the text to the right, it will show the item's cost times its cost ratio rounded into an integer. That's what that whole little statement there means. And if you do try and copy my statements, the spacing is important. This spacing doesn't work in the engine. So just so you know, the spacing is very deliberate in these statements here. Don't go adding spaces where you don't see them, or if you did this, it wouldn't work as well. Just wanted to throw that out there in case people try it. And don't put extra spaces. It's not going to work. So it's not the most flexible interpreter that I've built, unfortunately. But it works. Mind your spaces. When you select a unit, it calls a check by mech trigger, and the source of the list is the for sale list that we generated when we first came to Pacifica, and then there are some other variables. So the target list, if you do actually buy the mech, where are we supposed to send it? Well, we're going to send it to the player mechs. Where are we going to take the money out of? Well, that's the money variable. And what is the cost ratio? We had a buy ratio variable that we set up initially. Basically, this means that all the mechs on Pacifica will be rather cheap because Pacifica has a cheap buy ratio. Okay, and yeah, things can get quite a bit more complicated. Again, I won't dive too much into these lists. The last thing I wanted to show you, because it is relevant for making your own RPGs and stuff, is what's going on in the battle maps. So if we go, for instance, let's see here. How do I want to do this? So if we go into maps, so these are all the Pacifica maps. You know, here's the training field map of Pacifica. And these things are animating. That's just because they can be destroyed. They're not going to animate in the actual game. That's just so you understand they can be destroyed. So battle maps, pretty much you build them the same way you build normal maps. You add triggers and stuff. And these triggers can be interacted with in the exact same way that we just showed. It's just that when you're in battle, there's usually a few different things that you're trying to do rather than show, in RPGs, it's a very prompt heavy part of the game. You're showing lots of prompts to players. In battle, you're typically not showing many prompts. You're doing some logic behind the scenes, but typically not many prompts. So let's look at the first mission where you have to run between beacons, and then we'll look at a few of the other missions. So Pacifica, training field mission 1. So here's our startup. The startup is its own special little trigger. We still have a triggers section where there are triggers. Unit selection preset basically means the player doesn't get to decide on units. Most contracts and stuff will have player selected presets. So if we go into, let's see here, maps, contracts, like deathmatch. Oh, actually, sorry, it's in scripts. Scripts, contracts. So whatever, pick your poison. We'll just load in this map here. You can see these are the, here are the maps that you want to draw from for this kind of mission. If you try and flee, here's the flee trigger, and you'll come into the triggers down here, and there should be a flee trigger. Oh wait, actually that's probably included in the common, in the general. Anyway, it doesn't matter. We can see we haven't messed with unit selection, and so by default players will be able to select their own units. In the first training mission, we're presetting units for the player, and if we come down to forces, we can see that this is a player. The crew is fixed. Crew list comes from here. The units are fixed. There's the spawn. Here's the icon. Here's the faction name, and so on. And then here's the faction. It is a player. So, yeah, hopefully pretty easy to follow that. We have some events. Events are usually things that happen, like if like a mech is destroyed or a mech takes damage or a certain time is elapsed. So here are timed events. If the total time of the map is greater than 35 seconds, then the mission has failed, right? In the first mission, you got to run to the beacons. Then here are the triggers. The first trigger is start level. So when the map first starts, then we run the start level. And we run a series of tutorial triggers. So these are a series of prompts. Welcome to the first mission, blah, blah, blah. And they can't press escape here. They have to click more. And then we do different things. We tell them about being a locust and how they got to run places. So that's what all those are. And when people reach beacons, we check to see how many are left. And based on how many are left, we give them a different message. Like, hey, you've only got 2 more. Hey, you've got, whatever. No more. Head back to the training field. This is one of the maps with probably the most triggers, honestly. If we look at, training mission 2, here you just got to find an enemy and kill it. So, here are the forces. Again, it's preset. Players are forced to use the WASP. We draw the crew from the player crew. The crew is fixed. All that stuff. The enemy is a drone who is green. The AI uses his guard to hunt, meaning it will stand guard until it sees a player, then it will start hunting them, meaning it will start searching around the map for them. Other AIs you can use include hunt, include guard. I think there's one called garrison, where units will stand still even if they see players before they engage. So you can look around at the different arena or the different contract JSON files and see how the AIs are assigned and get a sense of how they work that way. But here are the different spawns that the units can potentially spawn in. If you give a big list, one will be randomly selected. So this means the drone won't always spawn in the same spot. And then here are just some pop-up prompts to tell the player about the mission. And then when the mission ends, load a new RPG. It's the Pacifica map. And here's an important thing I haven't mentioned so far. Last script. When you're loading the Pacifica map, if you don't say anything, then the game's going to go in and it's going to look for the Pacifica Citadel JSON file, and it's going to load that. And so what that means is every time you go to Pacifica, it will load fresh. But sometimes you want to go into a battle and then return to where you came from, and you don't necessarily want all the lists and everything reset and removed from when you left. So if you call a map and you say use last script, then it will not load a new JSON file. You can still mod the last script and so stamp on some new triggers or replace or add to it, but you won't do a whole refresh reload if you use last script. So that's what this last script is doing here. We're also increasing the player experience, and you know, Bob's your uncle. I'm trying to think of what else I can tell you about the startups. So, you know, here's an example where on mission 5, the player can select units, but we're limiting unit selection to just one unit. Fleet trigger X is just skipped. Again, if you see a big X, that's just sort of essentially commented out. Fleet triggers mission end. The list of available units is the Chameleon, the Wasp, the Locust. And the crew is fixed, meaning you can't select the crew. They're sort of locked in there. If you go to an actual contract, though, a lot of the restricted training stuff is not there. So let's see here. Here's the player forces. They use the player spawn, player mechs, and the player crew, and there's no other restrictions. So you can, you know, assign as many pilots as you negotiated for in your contract. Here are different events. You know, if trigger. So if a unit is destroyed and it was a unit, and the player count is now 0. And the mission building count is 0, you know, here's a trigger. Your assault was a success, but you died, you know. Here's some other triggers. So this video is long and I'm getting tired. So I'm going to leave some of the mission stuff for you guys to figure out. Hopefully you can deduce it based on what I've told you so far. But yeah, anyway, hopefully this gives you a deep dive into how the maps work, how the RPGs are going to work and everything. As I say, I really could use some help producing Pacifica maps. So overworlds, I need the starport, I need the citadel, I need some villages, and once we have that, I can start stringing it together. And then even at that point, maybe I could get some people to help me build the RPG components. So we're not going to replicate exactly everything that went into Krasnock's Inception, but again, I'd like to sort of broadly try and recapture some of the bigger moments and give people a campaign that does a handful of things so people can see what kind of RPG experiences could you have in this game and so on. And then on top of that, maybe add a little bit more to the career. But then at that point, if we can get the darn save game bugs sorted out, I think this thing's ready for a beta. So yeah, I would love your guys' help. Volunteer in the Discord if you want to take on part of it, and we'll go from there. And if you have any questions, let me know in Discord as well. So anyway, thanks for checking it out, guys. I will see you out there.